Just imagine, for a second, a world where Athens and Sparta didn't just share a culture, but actually forged a single powerful empire. It's one of history's biggest what-ifs. And the answer to why it never happened? Well, it tells us something really fundamental about power, rivalry, and what it even means to be great. I mean, think about it. This is the civilization that gave us democracy, philosophy, and the foundations of science. They had all the right ingredients for an unstoppable empire, right? So what was the missing piece? What stopped them? That's the central mystery we're going to try and unravel here. So to find our answer, we have to start with the basics, the political reality of the ancient Greek world. And what you find right away is that it was a landscape built from the ground up on rivalry, not unity. This is probably the most important thing to get your head around. There was no Greece in the way we think of a country. Instead, you had this patchwork of hundreds of independent city-states. Each one was like its own tiny nation, and they were all competing for resources, for influence, for glory. And these city-states had wildly different personalities. On one hand, you've got Athens, this buzzing hub of art, democracy, and sea power. And on the other, its biggest rival, Sparta, a super rigid, militaristic society obsessed with creating the perfect soldier. I mean, you look at them side by side, and they might as well be from different planets. And this all comes down to the idea of the polis. See, a Greek person's number one loyalty wasn't to some vague idea of Greece. Nope, it was to their city. Being an Athenian or being a Spartan, that was the absolute core of who you were. Trying to unite them would be like asking two bitter rival sports teams to just merge and forget their history. It was never going to happen. So this political division was one thing, but it was reinforced by their entire culture. The Greek way of thinking wasn't just okay with conflict. In a lot of ways, it was actually built around it. This quote here points to something absolutely crucial, eidos, which basically means public opinion, or shame. Ancient Greece was what you'd call a shame culture. Your reputation was everything. And that constant pressure to maintain your honor, to look good in front of everyone else, it created this incredibly intense and often dangerous competitive streak. This all boiled down to a moral code that was, well, incredibly simple and tribal. Help your friends and harm your enemies. You had a sacred duty to your own people, to your city. But harming your rivals, that wasn't just acceptable, it was kind of expected. The whole concept of universal brotherhood just wasn't really a thing. But all this fierce competition had a dark side, a line you really didn't want to cross. And that line was called hybris. This is that moment when ambition boils over into toxic, destructive arrogance. The Athenians even made it a crime. Can you believe that? That's because they knew just how dangerous an unchecked ego could be. Whenever a city or a leader got a big dose of hybris, disaster usually followed. And this brings us to the demagogue. Guys like Cleon and Alcibiades, they were absolute masters at whipping up public emotions. They'd push for war, not because it was good for the state, but because it was good for their careers. They used war and the empire as tools in their own personal power grabs, and the consequences, they were devastating. So, what was the ultimate price for all this rivalry and political ambition? Well, let's look at the hard evidence from one of the most self-destructive conflicts in human history. The Peloponnesian War, this was the ultimate result of all that disunity. And you can see how things just got worse and worse over time. In 427 BC, Athens almost executes all the men of Mytilene. Just about a decade later, they show zero mercy at Melos. They just slaughter them for refusing to join their empire. You can feel this escalating brutality, and it was all building towards something catastrophic. 40,000. That's the estimated number of people lost in the Sicilian expedition. This was a hugely ambitious invasion pushed by that demagogue Alcibiades, and it was a complete and utter failure that crippled Athens. That was the ultimate price they paid for letting rivalry and personal ambition guide their foreign policy. So a political empire, clearly never in the cards for them. But that is not the end of the story, because the Greeks did build an empire. It's just not the kind you can find on a map. All their constant fighting meant they could never create a stable, unified empire of territory. In that sense, yeah, they failed. But here's the ultimate twist. The very failure to unite, that intense competition that tore them apart, may have actually fueled something else entirely, an intellectual explosion that would go on to conquer the world. And this is their real legacy, an empire of philosophy from Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle that still shapes how we think today. The blueprint for democracy that, for all its flaws, is still an ideal. Foundational breakthroughs in math and science, a language so powerful it's still with us today. This empire has outlasted any built by swords and stone. So in the end, the story of ancient Greece is this profound lesson. They had all the tools they needed for a world-changing political empire, but their inability to overcome their own internal rivalries, their own hybris, that was their downfall. And that leaves us with one last question to chew on. When we look at all the conflicts and divisions in our own world today, what lessons can we take from the ancient Greeks? What can we learn about the rivals we can't always see, the ones that live inside of us? Now that is worth staying curious about.